Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Robin Miller, Manager of Investor Engagement on Water at Ceres, and your co-MC for today's webinar, Water Risk in the Colorado River, an exploration of private sector solutions. Ceres is a nonprofit sustainability organization working with influential investors and companies from around the world on a host of global sustainability challenges, including water risk, both scarcity and pollution, the climate crisis, and deforestation. I would like to start today's webinar by saying that our hearts go out to those seriously affected by the global pandemic, and we are especially grateful to those on the front lines risking so much and working so hard to make sure we all stay as healthy and safe as possible. I also want to thank each of you for participating. We realize your personal and professional lives have been disrupted in ways we couldn't imagine just a few weeks ago. But your commitment shown by your participation today is greatly appreciated. So a warm welcome to the webinar today, Water Risk in the Colorado River, an exploration of private sector solutions. This is part of the Investor Water Hub speaker series, which I will touch on more in remarks about halfway through the program. As you saw in the description of the webinar when you registered, the Colorado River Basin is an important case study in water management, water stewardship, and water innovation. Nearly 40 million people rely on the Colorado River, and they need to prepare for a drier future. We believe the private sector plays an important role in driving policy and technological solutions on water in the Colorado River Basin. Ceres has done a lot of work through our water program to move the food sector to address water risk in the basin. But other sectors, such as the technology sector featured today, also face significant water risk. In this webinar, we intend to help you learn about water risks in the Colorado River Basin, to dive into how technology companies are approaching corporate water stewardship, and to hear from investors on why they are focusing on investing in the region. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, and I'm pleased that we have 5 experts contributing to the discussion. First, we'll hear from Rachel O'Connor, Senior Analyst at EDF. Then we'll turn to the corporate perspective, hearing from Fawn Bergen, the Global Water Stewardship Manager at Intel, and Paul Fleming, the head of the Global Water Program at Microsoft. And then we'll pivot to the investor perspective, hearing from Jonathan Morris, a partner at Encourage Capital, and Mark Robert, the Chief Operating Officer and partner at Water Asset Management. So I'm delighted to be co-moderating this session with my colleagues at Ceres, Cindy Clark, who's a manager on our California policy program. I'll turn it over to Cindy now to give some more perspective on why we at Ceres have been working with companies in the Colorado River Basin on water issues. So Cindy, I will pass the virtual mic to you.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate the introduction. So I lead Connect the Drops. It's an initiative of 34 large companies who advocate for resilient water policy in California, as well as take action to reduce their water footprints. So I'm going to take the next 5 minutes to explain why our Connect the Drop companies are interested in the Colorado River Basin, provide a brief overview of the innovative water policy we've advocated for in California and why that matters to the basin, and then finally share the progression of corporate water stewardship programs that we've seen. So Connect the Drop companies follow the water supply in the basin because, first off, many have a footprint there, but also the Colorado River Aqueduct supplies water to California residents, businesses, and agriculture, provides about 1/3 of all water supplies to Southern California, including 100% of the surface water in the Imperial Valley, which is a vital agricultural region for our state. And finally, as California has the largest water allocation from the basin of any state, California's statewide water regulations and water use can really impact that region. So Connect the Drops has advocated for a variety of innovative policies passed over the past several years. Many are the first of their kind in the nation, and they include a framework to make water conservation a way of life for all Californians, a transparent water data management system, and a safe and affordable water fund that was passed last summer. But policy, it's just one way our companies demonstrate their water leadership. And we've seen an exciting progression of corporate action around water projects. For many companies, Much of their water work was launched during the official California drought that was 2011 through 2019. Many of their water journey started with water conservation by decreasing water use through a variety of projects, such as changes to irrigation, water fixtures, and even employee behavior. This provides a really short ROI and often immediate savings in water utility bills. The next step for many companies seeking value beyond the water bill savings was installing on-site water reuse. They began investing in these more costly and time-consuming on-campus recycling systems as they were looking to address long-term water risk. And now we're seeing the next progression. These are highly collaborative off-site water restoration projects. They're creative, often highly complex solutions to restore water to communities and watersheds. And you'll be hearing a lot more today from our speakers on this. And with that, I'm happy to introduce our first guest speaker, Rachel O'Connor, Senior Analyst at the Environmental Defense Fund.
Thanks, Cindy and Robin. So I'm going to be talking today, providing a little bit of context for the Colorado River Basin and why we're working there, and talking about the NGO role in the private sector. So I'm sure a lot of you have a strong familiarity with the Colorado River Basin, but I did want to provide just a little bit of background. So the basin encompasses 2 countries, the United States and Mexico, and includes 7 states within the US, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. The river supports 40 million people, 11 national parks, 29 tribes, and 5.5 million acres of farmland. The orange that you see in the map here is the hydrologic boundary of the basin, and the green are areas where water is exported from the basin in order to support those communities. The basin includes 5 of the driest states in the nation, and you can see here that many areas throughout the basin receive less than 8 inches of precipitation annually, so it's a very dry place. It's also one of the fastest growing places in our country, so the red here indicates states that have grown by over 200% over the last 70 years. And you can see here that the red is really concentrated in the southwest portion. And this trajectory is expected that these states will continue on a similar growth trend. The Colorado River Basin states are also really important ecologically. They include some of the most biodiverse states in our country. They contain 57,000 square miles of critical habitat. That's larger than the states of Louisiana or North Carolina. And that habitat supports 181 threatened and endangered species. And so now I want to talk a little bit about the management of the Colorado River. It's governed by what is called the Law of the River, which is a series of international treaties, interstate compacts, and court decisions. The Law of the River includes the allocation of water to the US states and to Mexico. And these allocations were determined in the early 1920s and were based off of a series of years that we now know were some of the wettest on record. So essentially the system is over-allocated. More water was given to each of the states than is actually available in the river on an annual basis. And for a while, that wasn't a problem. But as cities continue to grow and agricultural production increased, we could see that demand started to outpace supply, which is shown in the graph on the left. And this had serious implications for Lake Mead, which is one of the 2 major storage reservoirs in the basin. And so this increase in demand started to decrease the levels in Lake Mead. And this was, of course, also exacerbated by a 20-year drought. And the Law of the River dictates that if Lake Mead reaches any of the tiers that you see here, the basin goes into shortage and the states have to mandatorily cut back the amount of water that they're able to use. This imbalance between supply and demand is exacerbated by drought, climate change, aging infrastructure, and increasing populations. And we recognize that it's difficult to get water to support the environmental needs in the basin if the system isn't stable. And so now, just to take a step back, we wanted to think about what role can NGOs play in order to create system stability. And so we have a history of engaging in Colorado River Basin water management issues. And we like to have a dual approach, working with local communities on the ground and also participating in statewide and basin-wide conversations around system resiliency. Our work is guided by a few principles. Firstly, we recognize that we are in an era where every drop of water needs to serve multiple purposes, particularly given how dry the basin states are. We also aim to work collaboratively with partners to develop proactive rather than reactive management and policy solutions. And we look for multi-benefit solutions that can support thriving communities, economies, and ecosystems. We work with partners to develop and implement tools that allow us to adapt to living within the physical limits of water supply in the basin. Some of these tools include investments in both built and natural infrastructure, crop switching, water use offsets, and voluntary compensated reductions in water use. We worked with the Arizona water stakeholder community to help bring stability to the system through the Drought Contingency Plan, also known as the DCP. With the looming prospect of major cuts in Arizona's Colorado River water deliveries, EDF convened meetings among cities, farmers, and tribes to develop specific ideas around water conservation and water sharing. And we also participated in the formal Arizona DCP steering committee process. Part of Arizona's DCP included system conservation, which is water that is left in Lake Mead to benefit the system and to try to avoid hitting those shortage tiers. EDF committed to raise funds to support system conservation, and with efforts supported by Todd Reeve of Business for Water Stewardship, we have raised over half of our $8 million goal. Both Microsoft and Intel have committed funding to the project, and we are continuing to engage with additional private sector and philanthropic partners to raise the remaining funds. Now, when we think about system stability, we need to think about the whole system, which includes groundwater, an often overlooked resource. And so groundwater development created a significant supply source for many communities, and the large-scale development of groundwater began in the 1940s. And initially, pumping was not really perceived as harmful, but after a few decades, communities started to realize that the groundwater table was lowering, their wells had decreased productivity, and there were water quality issues, and that nearby streams and springs were drying up. These adverse impacts of this large-scale pumping helped to facilitate the development of surface water supplies. So the depletion of groundwater required the augmentation of water use with surface water. And so we got the Central Arizona Project in Arizona and the San Juan Chama Project in New Mexico, which deliver water from the river through miles of pipeline and canal in order to supplement groundwater pumping and help stabilize the declining aquifers. But groundwater still remains an important resource in the basin and accounts for between 13% and 50% of a state's water supply portfolio. And groundwater becomes even more important in a dry year when surface water supplies are diminished. And while there is a law of the river, which tightly manages Colorado River operations, this is the patchwork of legislation on groundwater basin in the basin states. So, no need to dissect everything in this map here, but it's just showing the very piecemeal approach to groundwater management in the basin. And so the interstate compacts that govern the allocation of surface water don't usually address groundwater, which is often hydrologically connected to or used in conjunction with surface water. Groundwater is important because it supports many of the basin's ecosystems. It's the primary water source in many rural parts of the basin, and it's relied on by municipalities, agriculture, and industry. As part of the DCP, we know that farmers in central Arizona are going to be among the first to lose access to Colorado River water, and that they will turn to groundwater to supplement. We want to ensure that Arizona transitions to a drier future, that agriculture, which is a critical piece of Arizona's heritage, continues to thrive. We're working with the private sector on a pilot crop switching project that would ultimately require less water while still maintaining the agricultural economy of the region. The Colorado River Basin faces significant threats from climate change, drought, and growing populations. However, the basin is well known as being a highly collaborative place to work and certainly willing to try new and innovative solutions. And so I think there's no shortage of opportunities for meaningful and impactful engagement from the private sector. And I'll close by saying that Environmental Defense Fund is conducting a comparative assessment of groundwater use and management across the Colorado River Basin in order to identify opportunities where we can promote the sustainable use of groundwater resources. And if you're interested in learning more about our groundwater work or the DCP or work in the Colorado River Basin generally, I encourage you to take a look at the links included below. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Cindy, for helping set the context for the Colorado River Basin. So as a reminder, you can submit questions through the question box on your control panel at any time. We'll now turn to hearing the corporate perspective. So first we'll hear from Fawn Bergen, the Global Water Stewardship Manager, and then we'll transition to Paul Fleming, the head of the Global Water Program at Microsoft. So Fawn, I will pass the virtual mic to you.
Thank you, Robin. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Next slide, please. So before I share why we participated in this project, I'd really like to give some background and context as to why water is so important to Intel. Water is essential for semiconductor manufacturing, if you are not aware, and that is actually a big part of what our water footprint is related to. As in comparison to other technology companies, we are at the core of our business a manufacturer of semiconductors. We do largely our own manufacturing, and that occurs across the world. And what is required for semiconductor manufacturing is what's called ultra pure water. It's essentially the cleanest water on the planet, as much as you can get down to just H2O as possible, because what we're manufacturing is so complex and at such a small scale that any impurities in the water really can impact manufacturing. So water has always been a core part of our business, whether that is known or visible. We rely heavily on high quality water where we manufacture. That is, in addition to on-site systems and all of our buildings, where we have very large campuses around the world. And here I have a map that shows where our manufacturing sites are around the globe. We also have probably hundreds of other smaller office type locations, but what you're looking at on this map is the large majority of our water use as a company. And as you can see in those locations, if it's not too small to read, many of these locations are in water sensitive regions around the world. So even just looking at beyond the business risk, it's an extremely important issue for our communities, investors, customers, as well as our employees. Next slide, please. So our water strategy shown on the slide first is to conserve water in our own operations and buildings. We've been investing in water conservation. I can find records back a little over 20 years. So it's something as a company we feel is important for us to invest in across all of our operations. And this is everything from, in this photo here is one of the large water reclaim facilities that is under construction. This picture is in Oregon, and we have one already in operation in Israel, and we're building another one in the US. So we're investing heavily to allow us to treat and reclaim water on site for reuse. But we look at everything that we touch and how we can be efficient. So that includes our office buildings, all of our operations. It includes things like our cafeterias and any type of faucet that you can think of. The second part of our water strategy is to collaborate, and we really have a lot of fantastic partnerships with municipalities, environmental organizations that we have really cultivated over a long period of time, and those collaborations really allow us to kind of think outside the box and how we can benefit the community and leverage what we have as a company, and being having a lot of real estate, so we have space to look at, you know, everything from renewable energy, how we can treat water on site, as I mentioned, and this is a newer space for us, and I'll talk on the next slide about our latest commitment related to the collaboration piece, but it's something that we continue to expand. And the last one on that slide was the unique role that a technology company can play in helping the world use water more efficiently. So in 2017, we looked at what we were doing related to water and trying to understand, this actually came from our CEO at the time, what else should we be doing and investing in related to water. So we ended up committing to a goal to restore 100% of our water. We announced that in late 2017. We use a portfolio approach, meaning we look specifically at the watersheds that we impact, so some type of hydrologic connection to Intel, whether that's upstream, downstream, our direct water supply, or otherwise. And we began selecting and funding water restoration projects that really, it's a wide range of benefits. What we define the volume benefit as water saved. So if you think of conservation, protected, like an in-stream flow, water leasing, treatment to improve quality, as well as water returned. And so these projects are all led by environmental nonprofits. They're not Intel projects, but we're very proudly supporting and helping to enable these projects to happen. And we really look at, when we look at these projects, we're investing in projects, both nonprofits that have a successful track record, as well as the projects that have a long-term or permanent benefit. So we look at, we're looking for projects that have 10 years or more of an impact. So when we say we're restoring a certain amount of water, that is every year for as long as the project is in place. And just on the right side is kind of where we are now. We funded 24 projects over the last 2 years. We've restored about 1 billion gallons of water. And once all of the projects that we have funded to date, once they're all complete, we will be restoring about 1.8 billion gallons of water every year. So we're not done. We have more work to do. If you're interested in seeing about our projects, I put the link here on the slide. It's very easy to find, just intel.com/water. You can see our progress and our projects. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about why Intel supported the drought contingency project. You know, as I mentioned, Arizona is one of our large manufacturing sites. We actually have 2 campuses in the city of Chandler, and by volume, those 2 sites collectively use about 25% of our company-wide, so around the globe, freshwater use. And given that it is located in Arizona, water is really important to us. We have a great partnership with the city there. We helped fund the construction and operation of a water treatment plant, so we're going to be both treating water on site as well as just next door to us, working with the city. As I mentioned, water conservation has always been important to us, and in just the last 3 years, we've conserved about 3 billion gallons of water in Arizona. So then what are we doing beyond our 4 walls? Our water restoration projects, as I mentioned, the drought contingency plan, this project that we funded along with some of the other folks on this webinar, is because this is a really critical project to Arizona. So it really hit our key objectives. The Colorado River Basin is a big part of that. This was one of several projects, in fact, that we are supporting on the Colorado River, and those are 3 of 13 total projects that we funded to support Arizona. And now I guess I'm going to hand it back to Robin or Cindy.
Thank you, Fawn. And next up, we will have Paul Fleming. Hi, Paul. And to give the perspective from Microsoft.
Great, thank you, Robin and Ceres, for this and for everyone on the call. And great lead-in, Fawn. I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach, which really builds on the leadership that Intel has shown in this space, and then talk about the projects that we've supported in Arizona. So we made a replenishment commitment similar to what Intel did about a year ago, April 15th of 2019. That's focused around balancing our consumption associated with our operations, which for us is primarily our data centers and also our campuses. But I see that as ultimately as what a gateway to really having a discussion with environmental NGOs like EDF and others and other companies about how can we really improve conditions so that the replenishment activity is not just a balancing act, but an improvement opportunity. We look for projects that sort of address, I'd say, 3 S's. So supported by the science, ideally projects that are directional to the limiting factors or key stressors within a basin, that are supported by the stakeholders and the communities in which we operate, and that are spatially relevant. So that, similar to Fawn and Intel, that we're looking for projects that have a material connection to either the source of supply in which we rely on or within the basin in which we operate. To date, we have supported 14 projects over the past year and a half or so. Most of those are in the US. 2 of them are in India as well, where we have a significant presence, and increasingly looking for opportunities to pursue collective action through platforms like the CEO Water Mandate, the Water Resilience Coalition, and the California Water Action Collaborative. We're on a bit of an annual cadence in terms of how we go about sourcing our projects. So we issued an RFP at the end of 2018 to source an initial round of projects, and issued an RFI earlier this year. And it was a great response. We got 55 project proposals from 20 different organizations that span 7 states and 2 countries. So we're going through that process now, identifying some opportunities for our next round of replenishment investments. So next slide, I want to talk about our approach in Arizona. We worked closely with Bonneville Environmental Foundation, Todd Reeve, who was mentioned earlier by Rachel, and Val Fishman. They've been super helpful in helping to sort out some opportunities in Arizona. We took a portfolio approach. We actually have a very small footprint now in Arizona with our data center, but we were planning to make an announcement about our expansion of that data center and decided to couple that with up-leveling our environmental commitment. So we invested in 3 projects. One, the first one is a groundwater recharge project that will generate long-term storage credits that we are going to be providing to the 2 cities that are going to be providing water to us. That's El Mirage and Goodyear. Next slide. And I'm going to move pretty quickly, hopefully, through these slides. The second project is a project with the Nature Conservancy to contribute to a project that is helping to modernize some irrigation infrastructure in the Verde River Basin, which has more of an agricultural component. The first one, the long-term storage credit project, has more of an urban municipal flavor to it. And next slide is primarily what we're talking about today, and what Rachel kicked off is the system conservation project that supports the drought contingency plan that was developed by the state and the basins, or lower basin states. You know, we were really interested in this. It's a bit of a different approach. It doesn't have that same sort of a material effect that you can go out and look and see, like the Verde River TNC project. But what really spoke to us was how critically important it is for the state, and the array of stakeholders that have stood up to support this effort. And also, quite frankly, the opportunity to leverage our support with a one-to-one match from the philanthropic community via the Water Funders Initiative. So we're excited about this project, and we're excited that other companies are also participating, like Intel, and I believe there are 3 others and more to come, hopefully, and would be eager to help spread the word and generate more support for this effort going forward. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Fawn and Paul, for sharing your insights with us. And a reminder that we will have some time for Q&A at the end. So we're already seeing some great questions come through, and many of you did submit your questions in advance. So we now want to turn to thinking about institutional investment in the Colorado River Basin. But first, I want to provide a tiny bit of context about Ceres' work in this space. We've been working on water issues now for over 10 years. And 5 years ago, we created the Investor Water Hub, which is a working group of our broader Ceres investor network on climate risk and sustainability. We host quarterly calls and organize this webinar-based speaker series where we bring together experts to talk about pressing issues around water. So this group also worked collectively to build out the Ceres Investor Water Toolkit, which is an online resource providing case studies, methods, how-to guidance for investors looking to better embed water risk into their cross-asset class decision-making. And additionally, I want to quickly highlight a fact sheet that we have on the Colorado River Basin from another publication at Ceres called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. And this looks at the food and beverage sector and how this sector discloses and is exposed to water risks. I won't go into detail about that publication here, but you'll see a link to the fact sheet in the follow-up. So as one of my colleagues at Ceres says, if climate change is the shark, water is the teeth. And we at Ceres continue to believe in the importance of investors integrating water risks into their investment practices and decision-making. So with that, let us hear from 2 investors with experience in the Colorado River Basin. The first will be Jonathan Morris, a partner at Encourage Capital, and then next will be Mark Robert, Chief Operating Officer and Partner at Water Asset Management. So John, I will now hand the virtual mic to you.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Sydney, and thanks, Ceres, for hosting this event. I'll try to move through this quickly, and we can probably go to the next slide. A little background on Encourage Capital. We are a 14-year-old impact investment firm. We were started out of a family office and have gone on to raise institutional capital into fund investment vehicles. We do a lot of work around climate change, and in addition, really starting in 2015 when we began to look into the Colorado River Basin and the problems that Rachel spoke about in terms of the supply-demand imbalance, we've started to look at water as an investment opportunity, both to achieve an economic return, but as importantly, to achieve a positive environmental and social return. So a core commitment for us in this strategy is preserving working farms and ranches in the Western US. Agriculture uses about 70% of the water, fresh water in the West. And so I think if we're going to tackle the problem of the supply-demand imbalance, we really need to focus on agriculture. A guiding principle for us as a firm is that government and philanthropy alone will not solve the big problems that we face, whether they're social or environmental, and that private capital needs to be part of the solution. Next slide. So I think Rachel did a great job talking about the systemic problems that the basin faces, and so I won't spend too much time on the top part of this slide. I would say that one of the challenges that collectively we face in terms of improving the situation is really an arcane set of laws within the basin states around water use. And the use it or lose it system that has been part of the West really creates an impediment for change. Some of this is being addressed, There have been some changes, particularly in Colorado, around temporary transfers and other things that allow for the sharing of this scarce resource. But you know, part of the problem we have is just the laws as they exist on the books, and the fact that it doesn't create an incentive for farmers or ranchers to conserve water. Next slide. So among the things that we look at in the area of farming and ranching is how to reduce water use while making the farm or ranch more profitable. So we look into crop switching out of high water use, low value crops like alfalfa into lower water use crops. We look at improving the irrigation techniques on the farm. Many of the farms that we look at use flood irrigation, which is relatively inexpensive to implement, but not very efficient in terms of maximizing the use of the water. Throughout the Mountain West, one of the things that we've seen is municipalities, industries that can afford to pay more for water, going out and buying up farms and ranches which have the most senior water rights, often fallowing the land and then using that water for their own needs. This is called buy and dry, and it's something that we avoid, and it really creates a problem. You have many small towns that are dependent on an agricultural economy, and when you get rid of the farms and ranches, there's a lot of social dislocation that occurs. There's also tremendous environmental challenges that result. So figuring out how to make farms and ranches economically more profitable, more efficient in their water use. If you can conserve water and figure out a way to monetize some of that water savings, that's great. If the water ends up staying in stream, it creates an ecosystem benefit. Other things that we look at are organic farming techniques, low-till or no-till farming to improve soil health, which again can lead to more efficient water use. Next slide. So as an asset class, there are several long-term drivers that we think make agriculture an interesting sector for investors to consider. I won't go through all of them, but clearly there are macro drivers around population growth, rising middle class throughout the world, which leads to greater consumption for ag products. Farming historically has been relatively uncorrelated with many of the other major asset classes. It can be a good hedge against inflation. Technologically, in the last 10 to 20 years, there have been a lot of improvements which have yielded better yield on farm. And of course, it's a relatively secure investment because you're protected to some extent by the land that you hold. The other thing that we see and gives us some optimism for this as an asset class for institutional investors are the economies of scale. Profitability for farming operations increases as farms get larger often. And so for institutional investors that are able to take on bigger land, we think there's great opportunity. Next slide. Of course, if profits were the only thing that one were looking for in agricultural investments, I'm not sure that one would necessarily look in many parts of the Western US and the Colorado River Basin. As Rachel mentioned, these are among the driest states in the US. And so admittedly, there's a tension in the strategy that we're pursuing because our impact goals, which include addressing the supply-demand imbalance for the river basin, that creates a tension with the economic goal to make a return on our investment. And it's a challenge that we struggle with. admittedly, but it's one that we think we can overcome. Next slide. As we look at opportunities, in addition to the crop switching and the irrigation upgrades that I mentioned previously, increasingly we've looked more at other opportunities around water. And so aquifer storage and recovery projects are of particular interest to us. We think they can make a good economic return, and they can also help alleviate some of the supply-demand imbalance by making better use of a scarce resource. As we approach each investment, we go in very intentionally with impact goals in mind. Among the goals that we seek to pursue is preserving farming and ranching while reducing water use on farm, improve soil health, improvements to in-stream flows, fostering collaboration among cities, farms, and industries is a key goal for us in the Western U.S. There's a lot of tension in the states among how water is allocated, how it's used. We're seeing that most acutely right now in Arizona around sort of the results of the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan and the pain that's being felt in central Arizona. But this is a story that's repeated really throughout the West. So that's something we're trying to address. And groundwater is also a key focus for us for the reasons that Rachel mentioned. So why don't I stop there? Look forward to answering questions, and I'll turn it back to you, Robin.
Thank you, John. Very great insights, and I'll hear another perspective now as I turn it over to Mark Robert to share from Water Asset Management. So Mark, the virtual mic is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for including us on this call. So similar to, I'm trying not to pick up on too many things, I'm trying not to repeat what's been said, but we are an active investor in water. Water Asset Management invests both publicly and privately in water companies and assets that ensure water availability and water quality. On the private asset side, we own a significant amount of Western agriculture. We have over $300 million invested in Western agriculture, and we're firm believers that in order to solve the water availability issues in the West, you need to compel ourselves and our fellow landowners to operate more efficiently, both from a water usage point of view, from an agricultural investment point of view, but also from a return point of view. So if you go to the next slide. Can you move the next slide? Sorry, thank you. So we have a process where we, on our private agricultural side, we focus on investing in farms with water-rich assets that have significant opportunities to become more efficient, both from a farming perspective as well as from a water management perspective. And we do this in, currently we're in 4 states, and we have, we're pursuing transactions in 2 other states. But essentially, picking up on what Jonathan was talking about, we are creating scale at the farming level. So we acquire farms with water, generally flood irrigated row crop farms. We aggregate them up to sizes of 2,000 acres or more. We then explore other opportunities to create sustainable businesses around those assets. That can include aquifer storage and recovery. It can include solar development. It can include other infrastructure improvements to the irrigation systems that would conserve water. And then we're big believers in creating fallowing programs. So these are rotational fallowing programs on a portion of the property. So we preserve agricultural activity, but we move the portion of the farm that is fallowed, we move that acreage around the farm in order to conserve water, preserve the farming activity, and also improve soil health. And we do that initially on a short-term lease basis and then on a long-term lease basis. The idea being that we are collaborating at a very local level with our farm partners, with the local irrigation districts, to create sustainable water supplies for corporate users, for industrial users, for environmental users. And you know, to really crack this nut in the Colorado River Basin, you're going to need the collaboration of the local farming community. And as Jonathan pointed out, there's a healthy amount of distrust between those communities who are seeing, you know, population outflows. They're seeing a lot of pressure on commodity prices. They are looking for solutions that give them a better outcome. And we act upon that, and we use both agriculture and water as a way to improve their income statements, their balance sheets, but also to provide long-term supplies for the West. So if you go to the next slide, these are some of the areas in which we're operating. We're in California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, and soon to be Texas, and New Mexico as well. Our feeling is that each of these areas has different issues. We tend to own mostly surface water. We do have some groundwater assets, but we view surface water as a higher, better alternative. Much of the abuse that we've described in the water usage has been on the groundwater side, and so we tend to focus very much on surface water. Can you go to the next slide, please? One of the mechanisms that we use to improve water sustainability and water access is the notion of rotational fallowing. So I've described it briefly, but in essence, it is taking the consumptive use of a portion. So a consumptive use is the amount of water used in the growing of a particular crop. We do that for a portion of the farm, and then we rotate that area that is fallowed over a number of years across the farm. So that has the obvious benefit of creating water availability for the environment and for the end market. But it also allows you to improve soil health and eradicate pests. It allows you also to minimize your irrigation and some of the energy costs associated with that. And increasingly allows the you know, we tend to think it benefits the overall asset quality of the farms that we're operating. Ultimately, we believe that many of these farms, as these water values from the fallowing work their way into the economic equation of the farm, that leads naturally to an upgrade of the quality of the crops that you're growing on the portion that is in agriculture. So a movement that naturally goes towards higher value crops. We push for organic crops as well, and we think it's a virtuous circle. If we go to the next slide. So there's been a lot of discussion, and I wanted to talk about one of the things that we're actually executing on. And I think, you know, we talked about the DCP, in particular in Colorado. This is an example in Arizona that we were able to put together a consortium of farmers in an irrigation district called the Mojave Valley Irrigation District. It's an area where we had begun to invest back in 2012. We have acquired a total of 16 properties in the area. We worked with our farm partners to put together a fallowing program, which was approved not only by 11 other neighbor farmers, but also the Bureau of Reclamation, the Arizona Department of Water Resources. And this year, as of January, we are storing the equivalent of, you know, 2 billion gallons of water in Lake Mead. So this is a tangible example of a project that was involved collaboration between local partners. It was purely done through voluntary participation, and it shows the level of potential for collaboration between private landowners and you know, the larger community when properly incentivized. So with that, I know the time is short, so I'll turn it over to question, but the real opportunity here is we see an incremental potential to put 70 to 100,000 acre feet of incremental water into the system as a result of our investment actions. Currently, we're working on this year, we will have 15,000 acre feet of water that will be created through our fallowing programs across 3 states. And I'll turn it back over to you, Robin.
Great. Thank you, John and Mark, for giving that investor perspective. We've crammed a lot of content into this 50 minutes, so we have about 10 minutes for some Q&A. And so we'll actually start with a question for Rachel. And I think we can actually, yeah, we're experimenting with webcams on this one. But Rachel, can you describe why the percent of groundwater supply is significantly smaller in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming than in other basin states? The person asking was wondering, is this limited by geology or are there institutional barriers? Oh, and Rachel, you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so it is in part due to the hydrogeology and the type of aquifers that underlie these states, but it's also in part due to the availability of surface water supplies. So in some of those upper basin states, they do receive a lot more precipitation, and so surface water is more readily available. And in the lower basin states, where surface water is less available, they really, started out using groundwater, and then as they grew and developed, imported surface water from elsewhere. So that's why we see some of the lower basin states having a greater reliance on groundwater. However, those percentages can really fluctuate on an annual basis, given what precipitation looks like that year.
Great, thanks. We had a question that Cindy's going to ask next for our corporate.
Yeah, so this question is for Fawn and Paul. So are Intel and Microsoft looking at net zero water use campuses? And if so, could you provide any detail?
Just really quickly, we're updating our Silicon Valley campus, which will certainly have some net zero features. So that's the best example of that sort of commitment in our portfolio at this point.
Yeah, and I would say we're actually, although we don't use the terminology net zero, our commitment to restore 100% of our water, we're looking to be kind of that net zero as a company, not just, by certain sites.
Great, and we had another question that also is appropriate for Fawn and Paul. How is the private sector planning for longer term impacts, and what's the time frame you're considering? So Fawn, would you like to start?
Yeah, so it depends on what we're talking about, but there are certain areas, with our goal, we're looking, specifically the water restoration projects, we are investing in projects that are lasting at least 10 years. So I would say in that perspective, definitely looking at least 10 years down the road. Some of what we look at internally, for water conservation type projects, we look both at the short term, but also the longer term strategic investment. And that can be, 5-10 years.
Just to add to that, similarly, it kind of depends on the topic at hand. So we do have a preference in the replenishment space for these longer term investments, but that's not always possible. So we recognize that we may need to be making re-upping our investments in some of these water replenishment projects going forward. When we look at climate change, we're looking out a long period, so several decades out to 2100 at decadal slices.
Great. So our next question is for John and Mark. Are credit rating agencies asking questions about your water management and water stress analysis? And could you give some examples?
So we don't typically interact with the credit rating agencies for the investments that we do, but I will tell one story about a project. It's a biogas project that was developed using green bonds, and environmentally the project had a lot of benefits. The feedstock for the facility was a dairy farm, the manure runoff. And after the project had been financed and construction was well underway, I asked whether anyone had considered the water risk. The project is located in an area where water is under some threat? And the answer was no, which shocked me that a project of that size could be built in an area where the key input really depends on water availability. So I have a feeling that this is an area that is not getting the proper attention, but that's just some intuition, not based on firsthand experience.
Yeah, this is Mark. I would just say, yeah, the rating agencies have not really shown much interest in long duration water availability as a risk. We think it's a material risk, and actually we wrote a report with Ceres back in 2010 on the subject matter. But the fact of the matter is, what we do see is stricter sustainability planning in terms of development. More and more municipalities or industries or are being required to obtain long duration water supplies, 100 years, 50 to 100 years plus, to get permits in order to go ahead with projects. So there is an effort to match the aspirational growth requirements with real physical water, and that's something that we operate in, and we provide water to that market. We think ultimately that is where the market is going to go, that you're going to have this balance of growth needs and offsetting water supply in order to stay in balance.
Great, thank you both. We're getting lots of good questions in, so just filtering through. Question for potentially, John and Mark and Rachel. What industries or commodities do you think are most impacted by, or could be most impacted by, water shortages from your perspective?
Well, I think it's a long list. Okay. Obviously, water is a fundamental building block for life. So, let's start with housing. In Arizona, you can't get a building permit without being able to demonstrate a 100-year water supply. We've seen the effects of water shortages in places like Cape Town and what that does to the economy. Obviously, agriculture is going to be severely impacted by climate change and water risk. You got hydropower, oil and gas, semiconductors, as was mentioned by Fawn. The beverage industry, the list goes on and on. Mark, Rachel, you probably have more to add.
Yeah, I think certainly agriculture, we know that agriculture is 70 to 80% of water use throughout the basin. And I think one thing that's interesting is, water is a priority and tiered system. And so we know exactly who is at risk and in what order. And in Arizona, we know that it's farming in central Arizona. They're the first to lose their water if we go into shortage. So, that's kind of why how we're picking our strategies too is kind of trying to address, trying to both reduce the risk and help those communities adapt to living with less water.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think there's reputational risk. Clearly, if you are in an industry where you are perceived to be a large water consumer, you need to make sure that you have mitigation strategies in place. So it's a real risk. It's a perception. There's obviously how you handle it is very